My name is Emily, and for as long as I can remember, it was just me and my dad. We weren't perfect, but we had our own little world, and in that world, I always felt safe. Our house wasn't the biggest on the block, but it carried memories in every corner. The walls had echoes of laughter from late night board games, and the kitchen always smelled of pancakes on Saturday mornings. My mom had passed away when I was very young, so my memories of her were faint, like blurry photographs you can't quite make out. Still, I felt her presence in the home she had helped build. Dad made sure of that. He never let me forget where I came from, and he never let me feel unloved. Growing up, Dad was my anchor. He worked long hours, but somehow always made time for me. He would come home tired, tie still loose around his neck, and yet he'd sit at the kitchen table helping me with school projects. When I had nightmares, he was the one who sat on the edge of my bed, reading softly until I drifted back to sleep. Our bond was more than father and daughter. We were a team, two people who leaned on each other when life felt heavy. I think losing Mom had carved a quiet strength into both of us, a silent agreement that we would carry on together. Our home reflected that bond. The living room was filled with photographs, me in my kindergarten graduation cap, Dad holding me on his shoulders at the county fair. Even Mom's framed smile from the last family picture before she passed. The shelves were lined with books she had loved, and there were always little touches like the blanket she had crocheted folded neatly at the foot of the couch. To an outsider, they might have seemed like just things, but to me they were pieces of her that stayed alive inside the house. Every object, every detail told me this was my place, my story, my family. Even though life was sometimes lonely without a mom, I never felt incomplete. Dad filled that space with kindness and attention. He didn't spoil me, but he made me feel important. He taught me how to ride a bike, then ran alongside me in the street until I could balance on my own. He came to every school play, every softball game, no matter how exhausted he was. He wasn't loud about his love, but I could see it in the way he looked at me, proud and protective. As I grew older, I started to realize how rare that kind of bond was. My friends would sometimes complain about their parents not understanding them, but I always felt like Dad did. Maybe it was because we had been through loss together, or maybe it was just his nature. But I could always talk to him. We had our arguments, of course, about curfews, grades, chores, but even in those moments, I never doubted his love for me. Our disagreements ended with hugs, never silence. The truth is, I had built my identity around being his daughter. It wasn't about being spoiled or dependent, it was about belonging. I belonged in that house with its squeaky stairs and chipped paint. I belonged at that old oak dining table, the one Dad refused to replace because Mom had picked it out herself. I belonged in the rhythm of our simple life, where love showed up in everyday gestures, a cup of hot chocolate when I was sad, or a handwritten note slipped into my backpack before a big exam. That sense of belonging was so strong I never questioned it. I believed that no matter what else changed in the world, this house, this bond with Dad would stay steady. It was the kind of faith a child has, the unshakable belief that love could not be moved or rewritten. But life doesn't always stay the way you hope. When Dad started dating again, I tried to understand. He deserved happiness too, and I wanted him to find someone who could share the load he had carried for so long. Still deep down, a quiet fear crept in. I wondered if there would still be space for me, if I would still feel like his number one. I brushed the thought aside, telling myself I was overthinking. After all, Dad would never let anyone change what we had. Looking back now, I realize how naive that hope was. At the time, though, I held on to it with all my heart. I trusted that no matter who came into our lives, the bond between me and Dad, the history etched into our walls, and the love that had carried us this far, would remain unshaken. I had no idea how fragile that belief really was, or how quickly everything could shift the moment she stepped through our door. When she first moved in, I wanted to believe everything would be fine. I tried to welcome her even if my heart felt unsure. At first she seemed polite. She smiled, asked about my school, and even complimented my cooking when I helped Dad in the kitchen. But it felt shallow, like she was performing for my dad more than trying to connect with me. Little by little, I began to notice changes. It started with the house. Our living room, once cozy and full of character, suddenly looked like a showroom. The soft blankets disappeared. The candles that always reminded me of Mom were gone. Even the family photos started to vanish. When I asked Dad about it, he looked surprised, almost confused, as if he hadn't noticed. I didn't want to blame her without proof, but deep inside, I knew it wasn't an accident. She wanted the house to feel like hers, not ours. Her rules came next. Dinner had always been flexible with Dad and me. Sometimes we ate pizza in front of the TV, sometimes pancakes at midnight just because we felt like it. With her, everything became strict. Dinner was at 6, no exceptions. Phones off the table. No TV during meals. At first, I thought she just wanted structure, but soon it felt more like control. If I was late, even by a few minutes, she'd glare at me until I lost my appetite. The hardest part wasn't the rules. It was the way she spoke to me when Dad wasn't around. Her tone was sharp, cold, almost like she was testing how much she could get away with. She'd make comments about my clothes, my grades, even the way I laughed. None of it was direct enough for Dad to notice, but enough to make me feel small. When he was in the room, she was all charm and sweetness. The moment he stepped out, her smile would fade. Slowly, I started to feel like a stranger in my own home. The spaces that once felt safe now carried tension. I found myself spending more time in my room headphones in trying to drown out the sound of her voice downstairs. I didn't want to tell Dad at first. He seemed happy, lighter somehow, and I didn't want to ruin that for him. But inside I was carrying a weight that grew heavier every day. One evening, after a small argument about homework, she leaned close and whispered something I'll never forget. "Don't get too comfortable. This isn't really your place anymore." The words stung, but I swallowed them, pretending I hadn't heard. I wanted to believe maybe I misunderstood, maybe she didn't mean it. But deep down, I knew she meant every word. That was the beginning of the shift. The warm, steady home I had always known was changing, and no matter how hard I tried to hold on, it was slipping through my fingers. I could feel her presence spreading into every corner, pushing me out one piece at a time. And yet I stayed quiet, hoping Dad would see it for himself. I didn't know then that he already had his own suspicions, and that he was quietly watching, listening, and waiting. It all came to a breaking point one rainy afternoon. I had just come home from school, tired and soaked from the walk. Dad was still at work, so it was just me and her in the house. I headed straight to the kitchen to grab a snack, something I'd always done without thinking. But as soon as I opened the fridge, her voice cut through the air. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped. I froze, confused. I was just getting something to eat. Her eyes narrowed and she crossed her arms. "You don't just take whatever you want. You should ask first." Her words felt strange. This was my home. I'd lived here my whole life. Why would I need permission to open the fridge? I tried to laugh it off, hoping to ease the tension, but her face stayed hard. "This is not your place to do as you please," she continued, her voice sharp and deliberate. Then she leaned closer and her words cut deeper than anything she'd ever said before. "You're just a guest here." The room went quiet after that. The rain outside tapped against the windows, but all I could hear was the echo of her words. A guest. Like I didn't belong. Like I was intruding in the very house I grew up in. My throat tightened, but I refused to let her see me cry. I wanted to shout back, to remind her that this had been my home long before she arrived. That every corner of the house held pieces of my childhood. That my mom's love still lived within those walls. But no words came out. Instead, I just stood there, my hands trembling as I closed the fridge door. Her lips curled into a thin smile, as if she had finally said what she'd been wanting to say all along. She turned and walked away, leaving me in the kitchen with her words hanging heavy in the air. That night at dinner, she acted as if nothing had happened. She chatted with Dad about his day, smiled sweetly, and even complimented the meal. I sat there in silence, replaying her voice in my head, wondering how she could shift so easily between two faces. Dad didn't notice, or maybe he chose not to. I pushed food around my plate, swallowing the lump in my throat. Later, when I was alone in my room, I let the tears fall. For the first time, I truly questioned if I still belonged in the house. Her words had done what her actions alone never could. They made me doubt my place, my worth, even my connection to my father. I hated that she had that power over me. But deep down, something in me refused to give in completely. I reminded myself that no matter what she said, I wasn't a guest. I had roots in that home, memories that no one could erase. Still, I kept quiet. I told myself I needed to stay strong for Dad, that maybe he would see the truth on his own. What I didn't know then was that Dad was already watching more closely than I realized. And while I felt like I was alone in that moment, he had already taken steps to uncover the truth that she tried so hard to hide. The more I watched my stepmother, the clearer her mask became. She had always been polished in public, the kind of woman who smiled with her whole face, spoke softly, and played the role of a grieving widow so convincingly that strangers pitied her. But behind closed doors, the cracks began to show. I noticed how her eyes flickered whenever someone mentioned my father's last days, how her fingers tightened around a wine glass, how she avoided certain details like the date of his final hospital visit. It was in those small, careless moments that I saw the truth leaking through. I kept quiet, listening, waiting, letting her believe that I was still the timid girl who once sought her approval. Inside, though, I was sharpening every piece of information she gave away. One evening, she invited me to dinner, something she hadn't done in years. The table was set beautifully, candles flickering, the smell of roasted herbs filling the air. She poured me wine, her tone unusually warm, almost sisterly. "You must feel overwhelmed, Amelia," she said, "taking on all these responsibilities so suddenly. Maybe it would be easier if you let me handle things at least until you've had time to adjust." Her words were honeyed, but her eyes were calculating. She wasn't offering help, she was testing me. I smiled, lifted my glass, and said lightly, "You're right, it is a lot, but I think I'll manage just fine." The faint twitch in her jaw told me she hadn't expected resistance. That was when I knew for sure she still thought she could control me, just as she had controlled everything else in my father's life. After that night, I paid closer attention. I found letters tucked away in drawers, invoices with unusual charges, and whispered conversations she thought no one overheard. She was careful, but not careful enough. One document in particular caught my eye, a signed agreement transferring certain funds just days before my father passed. The signature looked off too rushed, almost shaky, but the timing was what struck me. Why would my father, weak and bedridden, suddenly decide to move money into an account only she could access? The answer was obvious. She had planned everything. The weight of truth settled on me slowly, not as a single blow, but as a series of quiet confirmations. Each clue layered upon the next, until the picture was undeniable. She wasn't just a cold woman who married for wealth. She had orchestrated my father's decline step by step, decision by decision, until his world shrank to a hospital bed he never returned from. And now she wanted me out of the way too. Instead of confronting her outright, I decided to let her underestimate me. That was my advantage. She still believed I was weak. So I played along, nodding when she spoke, acting distracted, pretending not to notice when she slipped papers into her handbag. At night, though, I gathered everything. I copied documents, photographed letters, and quietly built a trail she couldn't erase. It was exhausting living two lives under the same roof, but I knew patience was my weapon. She had rushed, and it would be her undoing. One afternoon, she walked into the study and found me flipping through old family albums. "Nostalgic, aren't you?" she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I looked up and smiled, holding up a picture of my father. I just like remembering him as he really was. For a split second, her mask slipped. Her eyes hardened, and I saw the truth reflected back at me. She hated that I still loved him, that my bond with him was something she could never touch. That brief moment fueled me more than any piece of paper ever could. I realized then that my revenge wouldn't come from anger or shouting. It would come quietly, like the way she had destroyed him, calculated, deliberate, unstoppable. I didn't need to expose her all at once. I only needed to let her believe she was safe, let her make one careless move too many, and then strike when she least expected. For now, I stayed patient. But deep down, I promised myself one thing: she would never win. The silence in my apartment that night was almost unbearable. I sat by the window looking out at the city lights, wondering how I could keep living like this. The anger, the pain, the constant weight of betrayal, it was eating me alive. For the first time, I admitted something to myself: I couldn't carry this burden alone anymore. I needed help, not from my so-called family, but from myself. I needed to choose a different path, one that didn't revolve around proving them wrong or punishing them. I realized I'd spent so much time reacting to their cruelty that I hadn't given myself the chance to breathe, to dream, or to simply live. That thought shook me. It was like stepping out of a cage I didn't even realize I'd locked myself in. The next morning, I decided to start small. I made myself breakfast instead of skipping it. I went for a walk instead of hiding under my blanket. I even smiled at a stranger on the street, and for a moment I felt human again. These tiny actions didn't erase the past, but they reminded me that I was still here, still alive, still capable of moving forward. Healing wasn't going to come in a single burst of triumph. It was going to be slow, sometimes painful, but it was going to be mine. A few weeks later, I stumbled upon an old notebook I used to keep when I was younger. It was filled with ideas, dreams, and goals I once believed in. Some of them were simple, like learning how to cook my favorite dishes or traveling to a place I'd never been. Others were bigger, like starting my own business or building a life far away from the shadows of my family. As I flipped through the pages, I realized those dreams hadn't died. They were just waiting for me to pick them back up. That night, I made a list of new goals. Some realistic, some daring, but all mine. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of excitement about the future. But life doesn't let you move on without testing you. A month later, I received a call. It was about my father's estate. Apparently, there were unresolved matters, and I had to attend a meeting. My first instinct was to hang up, to avoid stepping back into their world. But something inside me said no. This time, I wasn't going as the broken girl they abandoned. I was going as the woman I had fought to become. I wanted closure, and maybe even a chance to finally look them in the eye without fear. The day of the meeting, I walked into that room with my head held high. My stepmother was there, her face cold as ever. My siblings sat beside her, whispering like they always did. For a moment, I felt the old tension rise, the urge to shrink, to disappear. But then I remembered everything I had been working on: the walks, the notebook, the dreams. I wasn't the same anymore. When the lawyer began explaining the details, I listened carefully, calm and steady. My stepmother tried to speak over me, but this time I didn't let her. I asked my questions clearly. I voiced my concerns without shaking. And for the first time, I saw something different in her eyes: not power, not victory, but surprise. She didn't expect me to stand my ground. When the meeting ended, I walked out without looking back. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about reclaiming my place in my own story. And as I stepped outside into the sunlight, I realized something powerful: they could no longer define me. Their voices no longer had the final say. I had found mine. In the end, what we've seen today is more than just a story of family drama. It's a reminder of how fragile trust can be and how deep the scars of betrayal often run. We've watched how silence, pride, and hidden truths can pull people apart, and we've also seen the strength that comes when someone decides to stand up, to heal, and to reclaim their own voice. The core message is simple but powerful. Even when family hurts you, you are not powerless. You have the strength to rise above, to protect your heart, and to create the life you deserve. Family drama may break you for a moment, but it doesn't get to define who you are. What defines you is the choice you make afterward, whether to stay trapped in the pain or to walk forward with courage and clarity. If there's one thing you take away from this story, let it be this: you are stronger than the people who tried to silence you. You are worthy of love, respect, and peace. And sometimes choosing distance, choosing boundaries is the greatest form of love you can give yourself. So as you leave this video, I hope you carry that strength with you. Maybe you've seen a reflection of your own life here. Maybe you've felt the sting of being overlooked, betrayed, or dismissed. But I want you to remember you are not alone. You have the power to heal, to rebuild, and to turn your pain into something greater. Family doesn't always mean safety, but your story doesn't end in the shadows of what others did to you. Your story is yours to write, and it can be filled with freedom, growth, and hope. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. Hold on to the lessons, keep your heart open, and never forget you are far stronger than you think.